There are two countries which maintain their embassies in Jerusalem, El Salvador and Costa Rica. It just so happens that I live next to the embassy of El Salvador. When I hang up my wash, I can look at Ambassador Hassenson's window. And I once surprised her predecessor, Ernesto Arrieta, when I was hanging up my wash. I started to wave and yell. And his secretary was looking out the window, who is this person? So I said, is Ernesto in there? Yes. Well, tell him it's me. And he came, we're talking to you. So I live next to one of the two embassies in Jerusalem. And we're very happy to have Dr. Kranzler, who wrote this book, The Man Who Stopped the Trains to Auschwitz, George Mantello, El Salvador and Switzerland's Finest Hour. It's a story that's not very well known. I'm very glad that Larry introduced me to Dr. Kranzler. And as an example of how unknown it is, I was accepted to a doctoral program in Holocaust Studies with Professor Franklin Mantello at Temple University 20 years ago. In all my research, never heard anything about it, which is astonishing when you will hear what's in the book, what Swiss people did in 1944 in a seemingly spontaneous mass movement to do something. And now we have Ambassador Hassenson. Ambassador Eitan, would you care to say a few words? I know this is unexpected, but you're most welcome to. Ambassador 1 and Ambassador 2. It's Ambassador Hassenson.
Very honored to be here tonight. Thank you for the invitation. I met Professor Kranzler more than 20 years ago when I was deputy at the University of El Salvador. And somebody called on the phone and made an appointment for a Mr. Mantello and a Professor Kranzler. We had no idea what they wanted. Very suspicious and wise people. And they came with this fantastic story. Ambassador Woodfront was the ambassador of El Salvador then. Like me, he was a member of the Jewish community of El Salvador. He had never heard anything about it. And we started the research. And when I wrote to my mother in El Salvador, she said, oh yeah, she knew all about it. But never mentioned it to anybody else. I had the honor to meet Mr. Mantello. I was also at his funeral, where you were also there, Professor Kranzler was there. There was a middle-aged man next to me, and he said, did you ever meet Mr. Mantello? I said, yes. Did you? And he said, no, but I owe him my life. This was a youngster, he was young, a youngster, 15-year-old in Hungary, and he was saved by the Mantello papers, and of course he never went to El Salvador. He went to New York, and he's a professor of music at Juilliard's. And he was a living proof of a person that was saved. And, well, I'll let Professor Kranzler tell you the whole story. I just wanted to mention that El Salvador has always been friendly to the Jewish people. It was then, it is now. We are in Jerusalem, and being a member of the Jewish community, I'm proud of what my country did then, and is doing now.
I'd just like to say an impromptu word before I introduce Ambassador Eitan. I didn't realize we have the privilege of having the Ambassador of Switzerland here tonight in terms of who owes what when. We'll go back a few centuries to the Zwinglian and Calvinist Reformation in Switzerland as opposed to Luther's Reformation over in Germany. The countries where Jews found haven, the Anglo-Celtic, Bible-based nations of England, Canada, the United States, New Zealand, and Australia, which became the world's most prosperous and powerful societies, were all founded, well, England became taken over. Zwingli and Calvin influenced Holland, and from there the Calvinist Reformation spread to England, and out of it come the Puritans, and incidentally, interestingly enough, coming out of the Zwinglian and Calvinist wing of the Reformation immediately comes Christian Zionism, already appearing in pamphlets in the late 1500s, which I actually read in the original in the rare book room at Union Theological Seminary in New York. The Pilgrims, when they left from England, went first to Leiden, and then they went on to Plymouth. And these countries where Jews found and still find refuge and were able to prosper and live in Bible-based democratic societies are all coming directly from the Zwinglian and Calvinist wing of the Reformation. And now, just 1 second, I brought my homework. Here we have, just so everybody knows where it is. I know you know where it is. But see, you see here, oh, there goes that one. Here is Switzerland. No, that's Czechoslovakia. Here's Switzerland. And you go down the road a little bit to Hungary. And over here you have, you won't see it, so I can fill it with Bratislava. Then you have Slovakia, and where Rabbi Weiss-Mendel was. And Rabbi Weiss-Mendel's message got out to Switzerland, and George Mantello publicized it, if I got it correctly, Dr. Kranzler. What? Over here, I actually looked in my South Africa folder, South America folder, I had Central America. I didn't have a map. I got a lot of these maps. Father sent me all sorts of maps, but that one I couldn't find for Central and South America. But I'm sure it's there. So, Switzerland. There goes that map. So, Ambassador Eitan. Thanks.
Thank you very much. Well, I feel really honored to say a few words to you, even when it is a surprise, because I was told that my colleague from Salvador would give the introduction speech and I assist, but of course, very gladly so I say a few words to you, and particularly so as I estimate very much the profound work Dr. Kranzler is doing and has done. With history there is something very peculiar, because normally one thinks to know everything, and suddenly you come to a historian who went back to the sources, and this is always the best when you study history, that you go back to the sources. And probably from a very different angle he wanted to go into the history, you come out to discover that something quite different happened, and you have even eventually to change your own ideas. One has said a lot about my country, what happened in the Second World War. I think here it is very well known, between 96 and 99 more or less, for quite a heated period of the Second World War, of the unacclaimed accounts, the Swiss banks, the gold story, the refugees, you all know about. But what is surely less known is what Dr. Kranzler will show you tonight. And I think it is also worthwhile that we see once another side of my country, and I'm proud this side, hopefully, will show you that the Swiss are eventually money-minded. They are not the only ones, but it is a characteristic that we have. We have also the roots eventually with Zwingli and Calvin, because you know the predestination in Protestant ethics, when you earn a lot of money, that means more or less is with you. So it is worthwhile also that in our country, where you have this spirit, you have also the humanistic faith. And this is deeply rooted as well. And I think this is also one of the reasons why this was possible, what Dr. Kranzler will tell you. So I'm very glad that I can assist together with you to his lecture. And I'm sure he will enlighten us, and I thank you in advance for your assistance, and particularly to you, Dr. Kranzler, for your dedication to this particular question. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ambassador Eitan. On a personal note, my wife comes from Austria, and she was a school teacher when I met her in Dornbirn, which those of you who know Switzerland knows right across the street, so to speak, from St. Gallen. And in St. Gallen, the police chief, Paul Gruninger, against orders, and he lost his pension, but he did see that many Jews got across to Switzerland. And as an example of someone who was willing, he didn't have to risk his life, but he risked his career, and he did save many people. And as those of you who know the Root and Branch Association know, since we set it up 20 years ago, we're always looking in every country, whoever is friendly to Jews in Israel, Harald, Mark in Sweden, whatever their background is. There are people everywhere. And remember what God says to Elijah in the book of 2 Kings, chapter 18, I think, verse 19. I have to check. Elijah said, I've had it, I quit, let me go. He did go on a chariot to heaven. There's the Am Yisrael is hopeless. And God says, but I still have 7,000 men who don't bend the knee to Baal. And that's in every country, hopefully the case. There's always someone somewhere, and we look for them. So we're very happy to have Dr. Kranzler, who will talk about the Swiss people's extraordinary response to Auschwitz, the amazing rescue efforts of Mrs. Recha Sternbrook and El Salvadorian diplomat George Mantello, and Mazal Tov to Dr. Kranzler on the birth of 2 granddaughters.
First of all,
Yes, please do. Yes.
There are at least 3 people here I know whose life was saved as refugees in Switzerland. I think Mrs. Becher, right? Ah, no, 2, and me.
Thank you.
You are but 2 of far more. You know about it. There are tens of thousands who would say they have no idea. They would say because of the Swiss. First of all, let me make a correction on the title. Recha Sternbrook happened to be a heroine of rescue. I wrote a whole book about her, but she does not play a role in this story. The story tonight is one, as the subtitle of my book says, El Salvador, George Mantello, and the Swiss people. These are the 3 heroes, the indispensable heroes. One without the other would have been able to accomplish nothing. These 3 extraordinary heroes, and I call the Swiss people a hero in the singular, and Mantello and El Salvador as the government, and the Consul General, specifically Colonel Castellanos, were heroes that are responsible for the story I'm about to tell you. And you have trouble finding. Switzerland is a small country, Salvador is even smaller. But these 2 little countries, in effect, contributed for the Jewish survival more than all the other countries put together. Far more. Let me tell you this unknown story that most Swiss do not even know about, and we are hoping to spread the word so the world will know who the real heroes are, what the true picture of Switzerland is, and whom we owe a debt of gratitude as Jewish people, Israel, and as Jews per se. Let me start with the date is June 19th, 1944. The place is Budapest. The circumstances involve 12,000 Jews that are daily sent to Auschwitz, deported from Hungary to Auschwitz. The author of the following lines is Moshe Kraus, the director in Budapest of the Palestina Amt in charge of certificates to Palestine. And he writes, and I excerpt from a letter that he wrote on June 19th, 335,000 Jews were deported up to June 7th, and then since that date, a further 100,000. In the provinces, there are only 4 towns where there are still Jews. It will soon be the turn of Budapest. The number of Jews living in Budapest and the surroundings amounts to about 350,000. The ghetto system began in Budapest itself on June 16th and must be terminated by June 21st. He continues in his letter, the whole Jewish race is condemned to death. There is no possibility of concealment, and we have to face our fate. We do not even have the possibility of escaping to another country. There are only 2 possibilities left to us, suicide or the acceptance of our fate. The Swiss legation in Budapest has done its best, but unfortunately without any success whatsoever. The letter concludes with the words, help, help, help. Rudolf Kastner represented the Jewish agency in Budapest at the time, and 3 other sources, by the way, totally different sources, say the same thing. Only a miracle could save the Jews. At that stage, at 12,000 a day going to Auschwitz, there seemed to be no way that the lives of the Jews of Budapest could be spared. Well, a miracle did occur, and the messengers were threefold. A diplomat from El Salvador, a Jewish diplomat of El Salvador, and the Swiss people. Let's look at the story and see how this saga unfolds. By the way, I didn't just knock off this story overnight. It took me 13 years of hard labor to research and write it up. And you were told by Ambassador Hassanson how she met Mantello. I met Mantello through someone in Jerusalem as well. Since I specialize in rescue and rescue attempts during the Holocaust, I find it easier to take than the victims' persecution and the trauma they went through. I asked, does anybody know any, about 25 years ago, about any rescue efforts? They told me, go see this gentleman in the synagogue, he wears a beret, talk to him. And it turns out the gentleman was the one in charge of the Salvador papers that Mr. Mantello was responsible for, and he distributed them, and he's the one that told me about Mr. Mantello. I got to know him, and I heard a fantastic story, and I didn't believe a word of it. I'm a professional historian. My job is to be a skeptic, and I specialize in rescue, and I said, I never heard of you before. It sounds crazy. I did not take him seriously, not until I went to the FDR library in Hyde Park, and I found among 5,000 documents that I brought home, all on rescue or refugee board, etc., a 2-page document which clearly described the investigation at the end of 1943 by the Swiss government of the sale of Latin American papers to Jews in Switzerland. And it said the only one to do it on a humanitarian basis, gratis, was the first secretary of the El Salvador consulate. And that was George Mantello. Then I started to take him seriously, and I started to dig up documents. It took me many years to prove the fantastic story he told me. But I wouldn't accept a word that he said per se unless I had documentary evidence. 3 times over, not just once, because I knew I was going against the grain of all the historians, let alone people who knew or did not know about the story. So this, let's see, what did Mantello, how did he start off with his rescue effort? He was the first secretary in 1942. He had been the honorary secretary, the honorary consul for El Salvador for 3 countries, Czechoslovakia, Romania, and Hungary. You know, a small country can't afford a consul in every country, so they have a rich man represent them, and they have his assistants to the technical work. So he represented El Salvador in 3 countries, and when war broke out after Pearl Harbor in December 41, and most of the Latin American countries declared war on Germany, he was in Romania at the time, Mantello. He had most of his factories and financial dealings there. He was a very rich man, and his brother, who was his business partner, had already gone to Switzerland in 41 to set up a factory there. And Mr. Mantello ended up bringing in $1.5 million Swiss francs. Could live very nicely on that, especially those years. Today, maybe wouldn't be so much. But he could have been living high on the hog, enjoying the diplomatic circuit, which wasn't doing very much, and could even have complained and given a few dollars for whatever cause it was. But he chose instead to focus on the tragedy that was befalling his brethren. And believe it or not, he tried to get, when he got there in 42, when there's a long story in the book about his escape from under the Nazi hands, he tried to get all the Jewish organizations together and tell them, look, I'm going to give you papers, El Salvador citizenship papers. He couldn't give out a passport because a spy can travel on a passport. But he got permission from the Consul General, Colonel Castellanos, to give out Salvador citizenship papers. And better than all papers, these citizenship papers allowed an entire family, even created families, to have the protection of being a Latin American citizen. And the reason why the Germans chose to recognize these, everybody knew these papers were not real. Although, by the way, the Salvador papers, unlike all the other Latin American papers, which sold for very high prices, up to 3,000 Swiss francs. These were the only ones who were really legitimate because the Consul General approved it, and soon the government of El Salvador itself approved it. So they were the only ones really approved by the government that issued them. And so what he tried to do is get all Jewish organizations together, and he found it impossible. Well, the representative of one Jewish organization shall remain unnamed, wouldn't sit at the same table with the representative of another Jewish organization. We read the Bergson book that came out recently, an interview by Professor Wyman of Peter Bergson, describing his rescue efforts during World War II. He found exact same circumstances. And I don't think we learned too much from those years. The disunity of the Jews is legion, although the world thinks that we are united in a plot to conquer the world. What does Mr. Mantello do? He spoke to the organization separately, and he kept his word. Every Jewish organization or individual that had a friend or relative in the Nazi-occupied territories could come to Mantello. If they had 15 francs to pay for the tax paper and translation, you had to make a fancy document to impress bureaucrats. They paid the 15 francs. If you didn't have it, he paid out of it from his own pocket. He ended up spending over 100,000 Swiss francs just on these papers alone. And I read to you Ambassador Wieland, American Ambassador England's tribute to Mantello. And this was only the minor rescue effort by George Mantello, whose real name was Mantello. The family was a well-known family from Transylvania, which is claimed by both Hungary and Romania for a long, long time. And he had an extended family there. And he gave out eventually about 10,000 such papers, each one for an entire family. So these are the ones that were mentioned before. They know they were rescued through the Salvador paper. They turned out at the end in Hungary during the most difficult months of the final difficult winter months of 1944. They turned out to be the best papers. When Consul Lutz, the Swiss consul in Budapest, wanted to save French, he asked Mantello for Salvador papers because they were better than any other paper. We'll explain that later why. Now, in March, up to March 19, 1944, Hungarian Jewry felt quite safe. They felt, well, whatever happened in Poland, those who did find out, Poland, elsewhere, whatever happened there couldn't happen in our noble, chivalrous Hungary, known for its Christendom and its great Christian perspective. That can't happen here. And it seemed that way. It seemed they may escape the Holocaust. But the Germans, fearing the Hungarian leaving the Axis, decided to occupy Hungary on March 19, 1944. And Eichmann, of course, started his final solution immediately, not wasting any time. And he started the mass deportation, started on May 15, 1944. The next day, Rabbi Weissman will send out copies of the full Auschwitz report based on the report by two escapees who escaped in April 44 from Auschwitz, and the Slovak Jewish underground headed by Rabbi Weissman, Gizi Fleischman, wrote up a detailed clinical report of what happened in Auschwitz in the past 2 years, how 1 3/4 million Jews had been mass murdered in Auschwitz. Weissman also sent along his 5-page summary in Hebrew, to which he attaches our famous plea to bomb the rail lines to Auschwitz and the camp itself. And he tried to warn people, and he hoped that the governments would do something about this horrific place called Auschwitz. People did not know what Auschwitz was at that point. They only knew it was a concentration camp. They didn't realize it was a mass murder factory, the largest one that only the evil mind of a brilliant, highly cultured nation could conceive of. Well, as I mentioned the letter before, on June 19th, by that time, almost all of Hungarian Jewry had been sent to Auschwitz. There was only Jews left in and around Budapest. And the question is, what does one do? How does one do something to stop this terrible carnage? Well, first thing you have to have is authentic information. You cannot do anything. You can't even ask anyone to help you do something if all you have is rumors and even postcards which the Nazis inmates send out and they say they're going to a labor camp, they're enjoying themselves. They had nothing authentic of what the Nazis were doing in Auschwitz. And I mentioned to you that on May 16th, and I interviewed Nathan Schwab, the representative of Halutz, who got it on May 16th. Overnight he translated both reports into German, typed them up on his stationery on May 17th, and he distributed them, he told me, to all the Zionist organizations in New York, London, Istanbul, and Jerusalem. What happened in Switzerland? Nothing. By the way, at least 4 major Jewish organizations got these same reports by May 16th. All of them gave copies to the American representative of the War Refugee Board dedicated to rescue. And this man did absolutely nothing. His name is Roswell McClellan de Maximo. That's part of his name. He was the worst of anyone because he had the greatest possibilities of helping, and he did nothing but thwart rescue. And so we find that nothing happened from May 16th to June 19th. 0 happened. This McClellan didn't even send a cable to Washington. Everybody gave him copies of this terrible report what's happening to Jews, and he didn't even have the decency to let Washington know about it. But Mantello, whose family lived in Pennsylvania, and of course he was very concerned, he could not get these same Jewish organizations that he provided with free Salvador papers, citizenship papers, to show him copies of this report. He gave all of them papers, and none of them showed him a copy. So he, in order to find out what's happening, sent a friend of his, the commercial attaché, the Romanian commercial attaché, Dr. Florian Mantello, to go to Budapest to see if he can get some authentic information what's happening to the Jews. They knew terrible things are happening, but they kept it so secret. It was really difficult to come across hard facts, and that's the most difficult thing to correct. So Mantello went on a mission. Don't forget Romania was part of the Axis, and yet he had a hard time because he was part of the liberal faction in the Romanian government. And the Nazis gave him a hard time until the Romanian ambassador gave a push and got him to go. And he went to Budapest. He only had a transit visa. He was not supposed to stop over there. He risked his life. Mantello gave him 1,000 filled-in Salvador citizenship papers, signed and sealed. All the people had to do was fill in their photographs and the information. They could use it without having to send it back. He sent money and medicine. And the first place he sent Mantello was to his hometown of Bistritz, Pennsylvania, to give a few of these papers to his family and friends, and then to go to Budapest. By the time he came to Bistritz, there was a white flag flying, which meant in Nazi parlance, Judenfrei. No more Jews left. He came 2 days too late to save Mantello's family. Then he went on to Budapest. There he went to the Swiss embassy. He spoke to Consul Lutz, and he asked him have you got any authentic information what's been happening to the Jews? Consul Lutz, who had been hiding this Moshe Krauss, Lutz represented the British interests, and since Krauss was in charge of the Palestine Certificate Office, he could go under the aegis of England, and so he hid him. He saved him in the consulate, and he said to Mantello, speak to Krauss. He has information that you're looking for. And the letter I quoted to you before was given by Moshe Krauss, written by Moshe Krauss, to Mantello together with copies of the 5-page report, which I only recently found out was Weissmantel's, and the 5-page Hungarian report, which was composed by the Hungarian secret police, detailing every town and how many Jews were deported from each town. And as we know from the letter, virtually the only Jews left were in Budapest. The question was, to repeat the last sentence, there are only 2 possibilities to us, suicide or acceptance of our fate. How can we stop that mass transport of lives, men, women, and children, as we'll see in the Swiss papers later, to this horror death factory called Auschwitz? Well, Mantello returned on the 20th of June, the next night, in the middle of the night of June 20th, and he called up Mantello before he reached him. He said, "Your worst fears have been confirmed." And he came to Mantello, dropped off the 2 reports and a letter by Moshe Krauss, and he left. His mission was fulfilled. He risked his life twice, once going, once coming back. He had no right to stop off in Budapest. He had no right to bring anything like the reports. He would have been shot by the Germans. But he risked his life, and now it was in Mantello's hands. He and his brother, they immediately tore Kriya, which is the Jewish ceremony, tearing the lapel upon hearing the horrible news of his whole family being decimated. And most people who would be immobilized wouldn't be able to do a thing. For Mantello, it became the energizer that put him into a frenzy where he did not know day or night. Food, sleep meant nothing to him. He was going to stop deportations. Don't ask me how, even today, rationally I can understand how this man could even think along those lines. He's going to stop. Well, he did. And how did he accomplish that? He accomplished it in the following way. Since he was young, he always had very high connections. When I met him in Rome, and one day in his villa in Rome, I had to go upstairs to my room, and later on when he came down, he explained, he had the head of the Italian secret police there, didn't want to explain my presence. So, since he was a youth, he always had very high connections. He was very helpful to the American and British intelligence, providing them, for example, which I have evidence, of 1,000 Swiss chronographs, very valuable for the Allied pilots. And you realize Switzerland, a little country surrounded by Axis countries, you could never send them out to the Allies without being intercepted by the Germans. They used the sourdough pouch in order to transport these chronographs to New York, and from there to Bermuda, and there to the British and American pilots, the valuable tools that they needed for the bombing missions. This is among many things that he did for them. And he called in his chips, calling on the Alan Dulles, the head of OSS at the time, in Switzerland, later the CIA, and Colonel West, the head of the Commodore West, rather, of the British intelligence, and they in turn provided him with an avenue to publicize this information. They took those 2 reports and a letter from Moshe Krauss, and they gave it to Walter Garrett, the head of the British News Exchange, and he in turn made a news release which he shortly distributed to all the Swiss newspapers and the foreign newspapers. He put all that information into 4, summarized them into 4 cables. And then there was one facet. By the way, everything happened within 3 days. He got the information to all the newspapers, and the first papers that came out were on June 24th. Next, he got in touch with Pastor Vogt. Paul Vogt was the most popular preacher. He was known as the Flüchtlingsfahrer, the refugee pastor, a wonderful, great human being, a great Swiss who cared for refugees, Jewish and non-Jewish, and Mantello always supported him. He never asked for any of the service of Mantello. And now he called upon Pastor Vogt. He showed him the reports, and Vogt asked him, "Will you vouch for that?" And Mantello said, "With my life." Once he said that, Vogt trusted him implicitly, and we know from later testimony that the American British intelligence said the exact same thing. We trusted Mantello, and therefore they gave it their all to publicize it. What Pastor Vogt did was extraordinary. First of all, he said, "Look, I'm well known in Switzerland, but there are some internationally famous Swiss and theologians that you could use to support your cause. Karl Barth, Emil Brunner, Wieserdehof, for example, who was the secretary of the Nascent World Council of Churches. They will lend support and you'll get international recognition." And they did. So they wrote a letter. And let me quote from that letter that Vogt wrote and signed by the 4 great theologians. "These reports come from an absolutely reliable source," which is so crucial, and were brought into Switzerland through diplomatic channels. These reports have shaken us profoundly. Our sense of responsibility compelled us to bring these two reports also to your knowledge. And a man like Karl Barth, for example, one of the most outstanding theologians in the world, he got a hold of the Bundesrat, the highest Swiss governing body, and he wrote a letter the next day. He didn't wait for a week or two, them all over it, demanding that something be done to try to save as many Hungarian Jews as possible. And the Bundesrat, which was not particularly sympathetic to the cause, couldn't slough him off. You know, it was called Barth. You have to respond, and they responded. We have the correspondence. Yes, we tried, we're doing. Karl Barth didn't let up. He kept at it until he finally did something. So we have Dulles and West, and we have Walter Garrett in this little campaign, and then we start to see results. But before we get to the press campaign, Pastor Buck did something maybe even more fabulous. He created a church campaign. He made sure that every church rang with sermons condemning Auschwitz, condemning the Germans, and the Hungarian complicity. And I have a sermon of his own. I'll quote to you a few lines from that in a moment. From the largest Leonhard Kirche to the smallest village church, Jews were invited to come and hear about the sermons on behalf of the Hungarian victims of the Nazis. And this was throughout Switzerland. Every one of them. And I have evidence from the smallest churches of Jews who had gone there to listen to such sermons. And this includes, by the way, Protestant and Catholics. Although Bock was the head of the evangelical church, the Protestant church in Switzerland, and I cannot say the same for the Catholic hierarchy, with one very nice exception, but the people were there on every level and every single group. So he first, Bock created a 7,500-word report in which he details the information that came out in these two reports and the letter. In addition, he added other information that he, as the refugee pastor, had found out about the persecution of Jews, and he sent it all around to all the papers. And the New York Times finally picked it up. And on July 3rd, we find an article, very innocuous article on page 9, based on the report by Bock, and describing some aspects of the Auschwitz report. And on July 9th, there's a second report based on further reports by Bock. And within 3 weeks, Bock published a book called Soll ich mein Bruders Hüter sein? Am I my brother's keeper? In which he elaborated on that report, published it in exemplars of 7,500 copies. Within a month, by August, they had a second edition. That was the first book ever published about Auschwitz. And there was an ongoing campaign to publicize through the churches. And by the way, the churches were the only place in Switzerland that did not have the heavy hand of the censorship. You could say almost anything in the church and get away with it. And when Walter Garrett tried to put in the article in the newspapers, he was not permitted to say anything bad about the Germans unless it was previously published in a neutral country. So he put an accurate dispatch on the report as if it had been published in Turkey previously. And as I said, by June 24th, the first article came out, and it started to mushroom. By July 12th, for example, we find that there are 35 newspaper articles, many of them front page with big headlines. 35 articles in a day. It mushroomed so that we have a combined total of over 400 articles, which comprise the equivalent of an 800-page book, describing Auschwitz in detail for the very first time. The world got to know what was Auschwitz. It was only through the Swiss press and through the Swiss churches that the world learned what Auschwitz really was. And the condemnation of Auschwitz, which became evil incarnate, was done through the Swiss press and the Swiss churches. It was a twin campaign, a relentless campaign, and the pressure started to build up on Admiral Horthy of Hungary, who who still had a little autonomy. He had been complicit, he had been helping the Germans deport the Jews, and all of a sudden he's gone crazy. And the Germans report show that Wiesenmeyer, for example, a German ambassador, can't understand what's happened to Horthy. He doesn't want to continue. He had a meeting of the Crown Council. He says, the world is going against us, we can't continue this. And in fact, what Horthy did was bring troops into Budapest, send Eichmann back to Germany, believe it or not. The man who had been complicit all this time, and he was driving the Germans literally crazy. And believe me, Eichmann didn't let it sit down and take it lightly, because eventually by October 15th, he engineered a coup against Horthy. And you got the Schallische regime, which was totally pro-Nazi. We'll get to that in a moment. Now let's look at some of the articles. And first let's look at some of the headlines of the articles, and then we'll look at a few articles themselves and see what they sound like. You'll get an idea, contrary to the few little things that the New York Times published. This was an extraordinary different world. Look at the titles of the headlines, for example. The tragedy of Hungarian Jewry. A cry of pain fills the world. Murdered by gas and burned. The extermination of the Jews. A storm of indignation. Protests against the persecution of Jews. The Swiss protest barbaric extermination of the Jews. For the sake of humanity. These are just a few of the scores and scores of headlines that were spread through the Swiss press. To give you an idea, let's read, for example, this is a sample, or from a sample in the Swiss press. A profound upheaval has seized the entire Swiss nation, leaving no doubt about the report's accuracy, and has given us an insight into the gruesome fate that has befallen Hungarian Jewry. The sensitivities of our generation have become dulled by the terrible events of the World War that has already been raging for 5 years. But when we realize that this is happening in the heart of Europe, in whose culture we have taken such great pride, and in the country especially proud of its Christianity and chivalry, then we can no longer ignore the practice, the reserve of neutrals. Remember that word, we'll get back to that. But we are required to raise our voice, not only as men, but as Christians, but also as Swiss people. When hundreds of thousands of defenseless people are sent to their deaths, there is no neutral way, quote, of ignoring such criminal behavior. There's another article called We Women, voiced the protest of the women's organizations, which read in part, protests are a platonic gesture, yet there are events against which one must protest because if humanity is silent, then the stones must cry out. For 5 years, as we have news of mass deaths, bombardments, persecutions, deportations, we hear of it, but somehow it doesn't enter our conscience. Still, what has been happening to the Jewish people, like all others before God, are also our brothers. We cannot turn away. We women as well want to raise our voice in an emotional, passionate protest, the events which are far worse than the darkest Middle Ages. And we find the Women's League, the head, sends a letter to Mrs. Horthy, demanding action to stop this terrible deportations and persecution of the Jews. And Mrs. Horthy had to answer. And she's given all kinds of excuses. Yes, we're doing, we're trying, we're stopping. Here's an article of one sensitive editor, Swiss editor, who for the very first time, to my knowledge, realized the long-range implication of Auschwitz for Europe. And he writes, the attached reports were received by us from a quarter which leaves no doubt as to their veracity. Something in us, however, still refuses, regardless of undisputed proofs, to believe them. More than in the extirpation of European Jewry, we are stung by the destruction and renunciation of humanity, this method of putting a conflict out of the way by the most ghastly, inhuman, and disgusting means. These are things we somehow cannot accept as true, inasmuch as the consequences for the future of civilization will be immeasurable and eternal. Europe is much sicker than we would like to admit. What happened as a result of these? And these are typical of the article. Let me read a few more examples. A few of my headlines. An open letter to the President of the Federal Council. Protest by the students of Zurich. Mankind, how low have you sunk? What did the world do to prevent the murder? Protests, control. Oh, the time into a report. I won't read that one. We are all guilty. Collective guilt in the racist mass murder, the Great Terror, the Hungarian persecution of Jews, and the Swiss press censorship. Finally, the International Red Cross acted. The success of the federal government and the Red Cross. The butchery of men, factories of murder. These are these headlines, just give you an indication of what the article is about. Let me show you, for example, an article in which they write about the census. By July 12th, you remember what was mentioned by the ambassador, that there are aspects of the Swiss policy during World War II which were not very clear. We had the policy of refoulement, sending back refugees across the border. Incidentally, this was not a Swiss law, and it was merely a Swiss alien police regulation. And the difference is, first of all, my heroine had to be released from jail because she didn't break a Swiss law by helping bring hundreds of refugees into Switzerland. She broke a Swiss police regulation. And the fact is, if it had been brought to the parliament, which a law required, you had decent people in parliament that would not have let it pass. Which also meant it was kept pretty quiet. It was not in the public conscience as the Auschwitz report made everyone aware of what was happening. This was done very quietly, intentionally so. I have no brief for Dr. Heinrich Rodmund or von Steiger and that ilk. But you have to remember, this was not an action by the Swiss people, and they were barely aware of it. We know, of course, about the gold and other business transactions. By the way, these things happen with Sweden as well. And I hate to tell you in secret, the United States corporations, Chrysler, DuPont, Ford, dealt with motives for tax. And we have the documents. I have a book called Trading with the Enemy, which shows the documentation, shows what America did, American corporations did, trading with the Nazis for war material. And God forbid, when the Jews wanted to ransom a few Jews, that you can't do, you may not use ransom, that was illegal. Only the Orthodox Jews would risk arrest to do that. But these corporations were never held to the arrest. So what the Swiss did, that those other stories can be matched by quite a few countries. What the Swiss did on behalf of Jews can be matched by nobody. Perhaps Denmark can match it. But what the Swiss people, what did the Swiss people do exactly? First of all the newspapers. And we have 120 Swiss newspapers, again, from the largest Neue Zürcher Zeitung, which was on the forefront, by the way, to the small local village newspaper. Did the same thing. They condemned Auschwitz, the Nazis, Hungarian complicity, and then, most amazing of all, they started attacking their own government and the Red Cross for their indifference to the Jewish fate. By July 12th, the Swiss papers, I told you, ran up to 35 a day, made the Swiss government change its laws of refoulement to allow the Jewish refugees no longer to be called racial refugees, but political refugees, and allow them to come in on the basis of any others. But more than that, the Swiss people were dissatisfied with the government, with the Bundesrat and its inaction, and the Red Cross and its legalist excuses, and they started attacking them in newspaper articles, in sermons, and the most amazing thing of all, thousands of Swiss women, university students, and labor were demonstrating street protests in the streets of Switzerland, of the cities of Switzerland. This is long before the 60s. There were no protest demonstrations throughout the world, not in the United States, not in England, not anywhere until the 60s. And of all places, the state Switzerland, with its vaunted sacred cow of neutrality, yes, by July 12th, you know what they did to the Swiss people? They said, to hell with the censorship, and they just knocked off the anchor of dispatch and just wrote whatever they wanted, and they couldn't care less about the censorship. The censors realized they're fighting an entire people here. They're not fighting a few individuals, and they're not fighting refugees that they can arrest. So they gave in. They had no problem writing all the articles without any mention of a neutral dispatch. And they wrote articles, in fact, saying that censorship, let me see if I have it, censorship is civilization's worst enemy. And the censors really got it from the Swiss people. When they got after somebody, believe me, they didn't last very long. The same thing with the Red Cross. Because Burkhardt gave all the legal excuses why the Red Cross can't get involved, why the Red Cross suddenly they can't send packages to Jewish prisoners in camps, why things would be worse if they got in. And all of a sudden, when the Swiss people started protesting, and I mean the people, I mean the vast majority, because all those newspapers represented the readership, all those churches represented the congregants of the vast, vast majority of the Swiss people. And when they got after the Red Cross, we find a headline in one newspaper saying, endlich, with a big apostrophe, finally. In other words, finally the Red Cross decided to act. And when they did act, they did a terrific job. The government now authorized Lutz to protect all holders of the Salvador and other Latin American papers and Palestine certificates, incidentally. And the Red Cross did a terrific job of protecting institutions, especially Budapest, children's institutions, orphanages, hospitals, etc. And it just shows you what could have been done earlier had these same authorities provided that help that they did until the Swiss people forced them to do it. And that's why I say the heroes of the story as Castellanos, who allowed these Salvador papers to be given in the first place. The entire thing would not have gone anywhere without his approval and the government's final approval of the entire process. And Mantello, of course, engineered it behind the scenes, trying to get everything moving. But the Swiss people were the ones that enacted it in the papers, in the churches, and in the streets. Nobody heard of street demonstrations in 1944 for anything. But on behalf of the Jews, this is Switzerland's finest hour, which every Swiss can be proud of, because no country in the world could compete with the articles that they wrote, or with the fervor and emotion and the determination to save the Jews. By July 7th, incidentally, Horthy was so pressured that he stopped deportations. July 9th, Wallenberg came to Budapest. Now, the last months were not easy, and the neutral representative, including the papal nuncio, and especially the Archbishop, the one who became Pope John, the 23rd later, did a wonderful job allowing Angela Rota to distribute 15,000, for example, baptismal certificates to rescue Jews. So the neutrals found their finest hour during the last months in 1944, when the Shalashi, totally pro-Nazi regime took over and sent Horthy away, and the only thing that the neutrals had over the Shalashi regime was the Shalashi regime wanted legitimacy from the neutral countries. So it was a seesaw battle. Wallenberg and Lutz and even the Portuguese and the Swedish ambassador, etc., were at their finest during those crucial hours. And it was not easy because the Arrow Cross, those Hungarian fascists or Nazis, sometimes just shot people in the streets without looking at the papers. But as I said, the Salvador papers turned out to be the best. And ironically, that good American that I mentioned, Roswell McClellan, said they're no good because they can't even travel on these papers. That was the exact reason why they were the best. They could not be deported. They were Salvador citizens and they had no right to be deported anywhere. So the Salvador papers, the Swiss people's protest, and Mantello's engineering this create a scenario where at least 140,000 Jews left in and around Budapest, including those remnants of the labor battalions, were saved. Now, those who got Salvador papers know they were saved through Salvador papers. But tens of thousands of others have no idea that they survived in Budapest because of these three great heroes: the Swiss people, the Salvador government, and the Consul General, and George Mantello. Open for any questions, any discussion, any questions, we'll take on any Everybody is.
Do the Swiss people know about this?
No, they don't know about it, and it's a shame. We're trying our best to make the Swiss people aware of the great history that they have. I mentioned to the ambassador just today, I Xeroxed an article from Midstream called An Open Letter to the Swiss People by someone who had been saved in Switzerland, who thinks highly of Switzerland. But he asked a moral question. It's a moral question. Why was Switzerland neutral and not do anything to defend a civilization in that terrible time? Little did he know that nobody did anything like the Swiss people to defend civilization and to defend Jews when no one else did. And I'm responding to this letter to let the Swiss people know, and the Americans, and the Israelis, who, by the way, happen to be very prejudiced against Switzerland. It's a very difficult job to break down walls of prejudice. Swiss people, oh, I know, I have a relative who was sent across the border. I know this one didn't have his bank account. Yes, that's all true. I know all about it. And as the ambassador mentioned, when I wrote the book, Heroine of Rescue, about Reich Sternburg, all I knew was the laws of refoulement and the bad aspect of Switzerland. I didn't come to protect Switzerland, but the facts are facts, and the documents are all very unequivocal, absolute, and I have all the original Swiss newspapers. By the way, Yad Vashem has a second copy. Someone can even go to Yad Vashem. I'll try to get the ambassador a few examples of the Swiss papers. You'll have an idea. I wasn't making this up. These are extraordinary articles representing the real Swiss people and the spirit that no one else in the world showed.
What did Mrs. Sternburg?
Mrs. Sternburg was an extraordinary heroine of rescue. She was a charismatic personality that convinced, for example, Monsignor Bernardini, the papal nuncio, to help in the rescue. She got what he called a Grüniger to work with her in legitimizing or bringing over refugees into St. Gallen, and then either getting them visas to other countries or getting them legitimized in Switzerland. So she worked for 10 years on rescue. She dealt later with music. By the way, I do have one connection between Sternburg and the Mantello story. The face of Germany was so blackened by the Swiss press. It was so terrible. We have, for example, the Swiss censors recorded the conversation of two low-level German diplomats in Switzerland. They were going crazy, not because Germany was losing the war, because they could not stand the blackening of the German reputation in the Swiss papers. They couldn't take it. And so when Himmler, when Reverend Sternburg convinced Music, who was not exactly among the finest people, he was a friend of Himmler and a fascist editor, a former president of Switzerland, a publisher of an anti-Semitic newspaper, the right person to save Jews, right? She convinced him to go to Berlin and try to ransom Jews still left in the concentration camp. And he did it, and he did a terrific job. Tragically, the story ends in a book where due to some machinations of some people, it didn't quite work out, but a train of 1,200 came out of Theresienstadt. 4 camps were now blown up. But the point, the connection between Mantello and Sternburg is that the Swiss press and church had so blackened the reputation of the Germans that Himmler was willing in his negotiation on behalf of the Jews, where money was secondary to getting articles that made the Germans look halfway decent. So they were going crazy with Mantello and the church and press campaigns against Germany.
How many Jews did the Swiss agree to take in the 1938 Vienna conference?
The Swiss eventually took in 25,000, but it was not...
How many at the conference?
At the conference, I don't remember exactly. It wasn't very high.
Did you say the word was zero?
It was probably, I don't know if they said zero, but...
They put through the piece of paper which said zero.
I'm sorry.
They submitted a piece of paper which is available which says zero.
Sorry, please. Yeah, it probably was that. And what they did was, what's his name? Rothman put that famous J on the passports, which the Germans were at first hesitating because the only thing the Germans ever feared was retribution. They were afraid others would put the G.
Why were the Swiss afraid to take in any Jews at the Vienna conference? Why was it?
Why were all the world's nations afraid to take in Jews?
But they were right on their border. They saw people coming to their doors. The people
Switzerland had 7 million
were a long
people.
way away. People
Excuse me.
were at their doors.
Compare Switzerland to the United States, for example.
The United States was a
The
long
United
way
States did not lower its quota 1 iota. Not one person more was taken above the quota. The only thing that Roosevelt, the 2 humanitarian gestures, one of 2 that Roosevelt did, and believe me, he didn't do very much. Okay, and he could have done 1,000 times more than the Swiss, given his power. It was to allow. Well, let me just finish one thing. I'll get to your question. I'll explain. You have an important question I'd like to answer. Roosevelt permitted, at the behest of the Jewish Labor Committee and the AFL-CIO, to permit the bringing into America, quote, above quota emergency visitors visas. These are for an elitist program to bring in endangered union leaders after the fall of France, artists, intellectuals, Hannah Arendt, for example, Jacques Lifshitz, were among 2,000 that were brought in above the quota. That was the only concession made to the quota, was not lifted 1 iota. In fact, they could have, a lot less people came in the 30s because of the Depression. They could have added those, and they did not add it either. England did something magnanimous. They allowed 50,000 Jews, with 10,000 children included, to come into England in the 30s, partly because of the Munich debacle. They relented and allowed Jews to come in. But how many countries opened up their doors? Australia, Canada, like the book has one is too many. Switzerland was not any worse than any other country, on the contrary.
They were on the border. People were banging on the door. They were getting places on the
Hold it.
door.
If you want to have a discussion with Dr. Kranzler, do it in the break. We have a lot of people who have questions and comments.
No, the fact is, all the democracies, you're going to look at them and you're going to look at their policies in the 30s. Who opened up the doors? The Dominican Republic. Okay, dictator Trujillo was willing to accept 100,000 Jews and Islamers. The only offer. Otherwise, no country made an offer per se. So if you're going to look at Switzerland with 7 million people, and look at the other countries, much larger countries, much larger areas, much greater capacity. If you're going to want to condemn a country, you can take the entire world, and you wouldn't have very many that were left. And what they did finally to save 140,000 Jews, no country compared with. Okay? So in that moment, there's an old Talmudic statement which says, Yesh kona oloma b'shah achas. One can achieve immortality in a mere moment. Those 2 or 3 months in 44 was that moment for the Swiss people. I don't say the Swiss government, I don't say the Red Cross, and I don't say the banks. They are not my heroes, shall we say. But the Swiss people were extraordinary, and we owe them a debt of gratitude. Okay?
Yeah, I just wanted to mention, it was brought to the attention of the army community back in Kristallnacht, that an Israeli came to town who was a Bulgarian Jew, and he recounted the whole story of how the Bulgarian people in the Bulgarian church marched in Sofia and was able to push the government to make sure that the Jews were not deported, and all the Jews that were Bulgarian citizens were saved.
You had one point, Bulgarian citizens, because they were
That's right, there was
others were
12,000.
deported.
That's right, there was
Bulgarian
12,000,
citizen,
right.
which is still a disputed historical event about the king and others.
Well, but they said that the king didn't want to offend the Germans.
This is not
but that the people,
clearly,
but that the people support. You know, the people in the church put themselves on the line to sway the king and a fascist interior minister against going along with the Germans and deporting the Jews. I'm just telling you the story. It was done by an Israeli, and it was done.
I understand. I'm aware of that story, and I applaud anyone who saved any Jews. And Italian people did some wonderful things too. But this is the singular most unique and the largest of all rescue efforts, and it was participated in on every level of the Swiss people. That's the amazing thing. All the Swiss newspapers, and by the way, you did have some pro-Nazi newspapers in Switzerland, but you had pro-Nazis in Denmark as well. I'm not saying it was 100%, every Swiss was an angel, but if you have 90 to 95% of the people doing things that are not done anywhere in a fashion not comparable anywhere, there's something really special about the Swiss people. Yes, it took the moral leadership of some great theologians, but they pulled up people who were capable of reaching that level. You couldn't do that in Germany, you couldn't do it in Poland, you couldn't do it in a lot of places. There were some rare hands over here before.
Did Mantello send a copy to the Pope? And what was the Pope's reaction?
The Pope was actually the first one to respond on June 25th, but it was not the result of the press campaign. I found the other evidence, and it took me a long time to find it because there were Hungarian diplomats in the Vatican from the liberal side who presented some of this material, not the Swiss, but the Auschwitz reports to him. And he responded on June 25th with a gentle cable to Horthy, and that was publicized in all the Swiss newspapers. When the Swedish king sent the same thing to, I forgot to tell you, within 10 days, Roosevelt sent a warning. Churchill, Foreign Minister Eden, sent a warning. And King of Sweden sent a warning. And Sweden has special relations with Hungary, representing them in the First and Second World War. So when these warnings suddenly came out from the West, they had never been openly discussed. The British intelligence knew exactly what Auschwitz was. They had pictures, you can see them in the National Archives. The American intelligence knew exactly what Auschwitz was. When it's kept a secret, nobody has to do anything about it. And then Roosevelt, in the middle of an election campaign, in June, May, imagine if he got those reports that Weissmundel sent out on May 15th. By the way, he did, the Jewish organizations got them. Okay, and it's part of my new work I'm working now on the response by the Jews. You want to complain about America or Switzerland or Britain? What about the Jewish organizations that had the reports and refused to bother President Roosevelt about a little thing called Auschwitz in the heat of an election campaign when you could have gotten very easily for him to approve bombing Auschwitz? It was not a major task. And they did bomb Auschwitz, by the way, accidentally, because I interviewed 3 people whose friends were killed right in front of them when they accidentally dropped bombs near the crematorium, but they were out to bomb the synthetic fuel plants, not to save Jews. So it was all kind of excuses they had. But if we're going to complain about the nations doing anything, let me tell you a little secret. I found 11 copies of the Auschwitz report sent to Jerusalem by, Schwal and others who had copies, and they were in the Central Zionist Archives in the old Jewish Agency building. Now you look for it, you won't find any copy, by the way. Second of all, not one was reported in the Jewish press in Palestine. Compare that to the Swiss press, okay? Now, Palestine was not under occupation. Yes, there was censorship.
Yes, it was. The British were here.
The British were here, and you published all kinds of things. Not one of the reports was even summarized in the Palestine press. And it was not because the British were there. I'll tell the reason in my next book. But don't start looking for condemnation of the Swiss. They were extraordinary. Compare them, yes, to the Jews in Palestine. Compare them to the Jews in America, to the Jews in England, to the Jews in Sweden. You want to see who did what? Well, give you some wonderful examples. That's what my new work is all about, the response of Jews throughout the free world to possibilities, potential rescue possibilities. The story doesn't look very good. So when you start looking at the Swiss people, they, to me, are simply the exemplar, the paradigm of a moral issue. I mentioned, I Xeroxed today in the article about the Swiss who asked the moral question, why weren't the Swiss involved? Why were they neutral when facing such evil incarnate? They were not neutral, and they said, the hell with neutrality, and they did something about it. And no one else in the world could compare what they did.
I want to ask...
Just 1 second. We take questions and comments, but we also want to allow, we're running a little bit over. I should have perhaps scheduled the second lecture for 8. But if anyone wants to do your jumping jacks or Tai Chi or go down to the Israel Center Cafe and get something to eat or drink, which you can bring up here, please feel free to do so. And those who want to continue asking questions and making comments while Dr. Kranzler is here before he goes back to the United States, also continue to do so. So if anyone wants to go downstairs, you can bring dinner back upstairs, you're the most welcome.
Book available,
The book is at Syracuse University Press. Shall we say, it's very good distribution, but Amazon.com or BarnesandNoble.com can get you the book. I think I had a copy here before. Do you know what that is?
Yes.
Yeah, I read the copy.
Oh,
yes, yeah,
Yes, of course.
Yeah, this is available. In fact, paperback is not even exorbitant, it's only $20. But it represents 13 years of hard labor of love. And it's something that made me look at the Swiss people in a totally different way. And I hope everybody else gets the same perspective. Go ahead.
Like a child who was brought in 1942 in Holland.
From where? From France?
From France, yes, coming from Belgium. I want to know a little bit what is written about what happened to the children in the camp in Switzerland, because it was not the paradise. It was really very, very hard time.
Yes.
Very hard time.
Shall I tell you about the children in the Jewish homes that were made to work like maids? Shall we tell you about some of those children? A friend of mine is writing a book about the children brought into Switzerland. She happens to be the archivist at the Joint, and that book will come out. You'll find out all about the children. But don't try to get a one-sided picture. Let me just tell you.
No, it's my life.
It's your life, but
Not a picture.
just remember that
It's
my
not
wife was also a child brought into Switzerland. She was in Co in the internment camp. It wasn't so good. Believe me, it was a lot better than very Belgium where they took them out of. Okay? But if we're going to ask questions about how some of them were treated, it's possible some of them were not treated too well. But so did some of the Swiss Jews did not treat those Swiss children well either. It's a sad story, but some Jews in Switzerland have a difficult account to give one of these years. In England, the United States.
No, I don't agree with you. I will tell you. I met now, it's very amazing, since 2 months here in Israel, of the people who went through the same experience as myself. We were very young children.
Were you adopted by...
We were separated from our parents.
Right, but were you adopted by Swiss families?
Absolutely not. I was in a camp with more than, I don't know how many hundreds of children,
Yes.
without the parents. And we were without the parents, we were hidden children in France. So we continue to be separated from our parents. I never understand, and I want that somebody explain to me what was the rationality.
Well, I'm not here to defend the government's policy. If that policy was there, and I'm not arguing with you on your example, but I just said, I know of a lot of cases of Jewish children who were adopted by Jewish families whose lives were not exactly, shall we say, I don't want to say the word. Anyhow, they were taken advantage of and made into servants and maids in many cases.
I know my mother was a maid.
Okay. Now, your mother was a maid, but I can understand better. But children who were adopted by Jewish families, it's a little different story. That's a different story. As I said, when that book comes out, she focuses on all the children, the thousands of children that were brought into Switzerland. By the way, there was a case of 750 children who were permitted to go to Switzerland in 42, and it was a Jewish organization that prevented it. So if we're going to lay the guilt on anybody, let's lay it all around, let's tell the entire story, and let's be clear and honest about everything. Not look at one incident or look at one side. My job, I have no personal interest in this. Again, I wasn't out to protest.
Testimony, and that's all.
Yes, but your testimony is not all pervasive, as a historian has to go through all the records, and from all different sides. And I said that young lady is doing an excellent job on that. When the book comes out, you'll know a lot more what happened to the Jewish children that were saved, by the way, in Switzerland.